structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal. In nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps, and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. I have reached the conclusions presented in this book reductantly. 10 years ago, I would have argued strenuously against the central claim made here, namely that something akin to a racial caste system certainly exists in the United States. Indeed, if Barack Obama had been elected president back then, I would have argued that his election marked the nation's triumph over racial caste, the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow. My elation would have been tempered by the distance yet to be traveled to reach the promised incarceration and our earlier forms of social control. Quite belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration in the United States had, in fact, emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control that functions in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. In my experience, people who have been incarcerated rarely have difficulty identifying the parallels between these systems of social control. Once they are released, they are often denied the right to vote and relegated to a racially segregated and subordinated existence. Through a web of laws, regulations, and informal rules, all of which are powerfully reinforced by social stigma, they are confined to the margins of mainstream society and denied access to the mainstream economy. They are legally denied the ability to obtain employment, housing, and public benefits, much as African Americans were once forced into a segregated second-class citizenship in the Jim Crow era. Those of us who have viewed that world from a comfortable distance, yet sympathize with the plight of the so-called underclass, tend to interpret the experience of those caught up in the criminal justice system primarily through the lens of popularized social science, attributing the staggering increase in incarceration rates in communities of color to the predictable, though unfortunate consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, and the presumed realities of the drug market, including the mistaken belief that most drug dealers are black or brown. Occasionally, in the course of my work, someone would make a remark suggesting that perhaps the war on drugs is a racist conspiracy to put blacks back in their place. This type of remark was invariably accompanied by nervous laughter, intended to convey the impression that, although the idea had crossed their minds, it was not an idea a reasonable person would take seriously. Most people assumed the war on drugs was launched in response to the crisis caused by crack cocaine in inner-city neighborhoods. This view holds rapid explosion of the prison population reflect nothing more than the government's zealous but benign efforts to address rampant drug crime, sensational media coverage, rampant drug crime in poor minority neighborhoods. This view, while understandable given the sensational media coverage of crack in the 1980s and 90s, is simply wrong. While it is true that the publicity surrounding crack cocaine led to a dramatic increase in funding for the drug war, as well as to sentencing policies that greatly exacerbated racial disparities in incarceration rates, there is no truth to the notion that the war on drugs was launched in response to crack cocaine. There is no truth to the notion that the war on drugs was launched in response to crack cocaine. President Ronald Reagan officially announced the current drug war in 1982, before crack became an issue in the media or a crisis in poor black neighborhoods. A few years ago, the drug war was declared. Crack began to spread rapidly in the poor black neighborhoods of Los Angeles and later emerged in cities across the country. The Reagan administration hired staff to publicize the emergence of crack cocaine in 1985. Most people assume the war on drugs was launched in response to a crisis caused by crack cocaine in inner-city neighborhoods. This view holds that the racial disparities in drug convictions and sentences, as well as the rapid explosion of the prison population, reflect nothing more than the government's zealous but benign efforts to address rampant drug crime in poor minority neighborhoods. This view, while understandable given the sensational media coverage of crack in the 1980s and 1990s, Images that seem to confirm the worst negative the timing of the images that seem to confirm the worst negative racial stereotypes about impoverished inner city residents. The media campaign was an extraordinary success. Almost overnight, the media was saturated with images of black crack whores, crack dealers, and crack babies. Images that seemed to confirm the worst negative racial stereotypes about impoverished inner city residents. The media bonanza surrounding the new demon drug helped to catapult the war on drugs from an ambitious federal policy to an actual war. The media bonanza surrounding the new demon drug helped catapult the war on drugs from an ambiguous federal policy to an actual war. The timing of the crack crisis helped to fuel conspiracy theories and general speculation in poor black communities that the war on drugs was a part of a genocidal plan by the government to destroy black people in the United States. From the outset, stories circulated on the street that crack and other drugs were being brought into black neighborhoods by the CIA. Eventually, even the Urban League came to take the claims of genocide seriously. In its 1990 report, The State of Black America, it stated, "There is at least one concept that must be recognized if one is to see the pervasive and insidious nature of the drug problem for the African American community. While the conspiracy theories were initially dismissed as far-fetched, if not downright loony, the word on the street turned out to be right, at least to a point." The CIA admitted in 1998 that guerrilla armies it actively supported in Nicaragua were smuggling illegal drugs into the United States. While the conspiracy theories were initially dismissed as far-fetched, if not downright loony, the word on the street turned out to be right, at least to a point. The CIA admitted in 1998 that guerrilla armies it actively supported in Nicaragua were smuggling illegal drugs into the United States. Drugs that were making their way onto the streets of inner city black neighborhoods in the form of crack cocaine. The CIA also admitted that there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in drug crime than people of color. That is not what one would guess, however, when encountering our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates 25 to 50 times greater than those of white men. And in major cities racked by the drug war, as many as 80% of young African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of a growing undercaste, permanently locked up and locked out of a mainstream society. It may be surprising to some that drug crime was declining, not rising, when a drug war was declared. From a historical perspective, however, the lack of correlation between crime and punishment, sociologists have frequently observed that governments use punishment primarily as a tool of social control, and thus the extent of severity of punishment is often unrelated to actual crime patterns. Michael Tomroy explains in Thinking About Crime, and I quote, "Governments decide how much punishment they want, and these decisions are in no simple way related to crime rates. Although crime rates in the United States have not been markedly higher than those of other Western countries, the rate of incarceration has soared in the United States while it has remained stable or declined in other countries. Between 1960 and 1990, for example, official crime rates in Finland, Germany, and the United States were close to identical. Yet the U.S. incarceration rate quadrupled, the Finnish rate fell by 60%, and the German rate was stable in that period. Despite similar crime rates, each government chose to impose different levels of punishment. Today, due to recent declines, U.S. crime rates have dipped below the international norm. Nevertheless, the United States now boasts an incarceration rate that is 6 to 10 times greater than that of the other industrialized nations. A development directly traceable to the drug war. The only country in the world that even comes close to the American rate of incarceration is Russia, and no other country in the world incarcerates such an astonishing percentage of its racial or ethnic minorities. The stark and sobering reality is that, for reasons largely unrelated to actual crime trends, the American penal system has emerged as a system of social control unparalleled in world history, and while the size of the system alone might suggest that it would touch the lives of most Americans, the primary targets of its control can be defined largely by race. This is an astonishing development, especially given that it as recently as the mid-70s, the most well-respected criminologists. This is an astonishing development, especially given that as recently as the mid-1970s, the most well-respected criminologists were predicting that the prison system would soon fade away. Prison did not deter crime significantly. Many experts concluded those who had meaningfully economic and social opportunities were unlikely to commit crimes regardless of the penalty, while those who went to prison were far more likely to commit crimes against national civil rights organization in the country